session. I'm honored to share some of my thinking with you around a powerful topic. I'm going to be talking about historic trauma in the African American community, how it can manifest in institutions like our schools, and trying to think deeply about healing. I chose the Sankofa bird because it represents the idea that it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. I'd like to introduce myself and tell you a little bit how I came to think about the topic of historic trauma. My name is James Iliff. I'm lucky to say that I've spent much of my life in and around the African American community. I grew up in America in a neighborhood that is predominantly African American. It was a profound experience. I experienced both the loving embrace of the community and I experienced random and targeted violence. I'm a high school teacher. I have taught in urban schools for over 20 years. I've taught thousands of African American students from all demographics. I've seen a lot. I've led college prep programs and I've mentored inmates. We're going to be talking about race and trauma today. I want to acknowledge from the start that talking about race and trauma deeply can be challenging. One cannot use words to sufficiently express the profound pain of our history. I want to acknowledge that I'm not going to capture the full force of our history or the complexities of our experiences today. No one can. I'm going to speak as deeply as I can on the topic. I ask that you give me grace and assume best intent as I'm laying out my ideas. In Minnesota, there is a tension in many of our schools. We are struggling to meaningfully connect with a sizable population of our African American students. Some of our African American student population come to school with challenging behaviors. This can look like disruptive behaviors, peer conflict, challenges to authority, absenteeism, and a general disconnection from academics and careers. I'm also seeing a majority white teaching force. I see a true lack of culturally relevant learning experiences for students. And I see a genuine confusion on how to make progress when working with our students. We have professional development sessions that try to help us improve our connections with our African American students and families. These PD sessions tend to focus on concepts like systemic racism, school-to-prison pipelines, and the ills of capitalism and white supremacy culture. I call this paradigm the outside-in camp. In other words, improvements will only come when the outside society changes. I understand where this camp is coming from. I think they are missing something deeper, however. After PDs, when we teachers go back to our classroom, we aren't given actual guidance on how to work with our students. I started to read a lot. I found others in the African American community who think that racial disparities are caused by cultural patterns in corners of the community choosing not to take advantage of opportunities, lacking discipline, or choosing immediate gratification over dedication. I call this camp the inside-out camp. In other words, change has to come from inside the culture. Dr. Glenn Loury is a prominent thinker in this camp. Let's take a listen to how he phrases it.
The simple retort, racism is not serious, as if disparities have nothing to do with behavior, with cultural patterns, with what peer groups value, with what parents insist upon, with how people spend their time, with what they identify as being critical to their own self-respect. Who could believe that? Anyone who thinks so is a fool. Asians are said here in the United States sardonically to be a model minority. Well, as a matter of fact, a pretty compelling case can be made that culture is critical to their success. Don't take my word for it. Read Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou's book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox. There, they interview Asian families in Southern California trying to find out how these kids get into Dartmouth and Columbia and Cornell and Princeton and Harvard in such high rates. And what they find is that these families do, in fact, exhibit cultural patterns, embrace values, adopt practices, engage in behaviors, and follow disciplines that orient them and their children so as to facilitate human development, which then manifests itself in terms of academic excellence. It defies common sense as well as the evidence to assert that they do not, or conversely, to assert that the paucity of African Americans here in the United States performing at the very top of the intellectual spectrum. I am speaking here about excellence and about the low relative numbers of Blacks who exhibit it, as if that has nothing to do with the behavior of Black people, that the outcome is due entirely to institutional forces. That, frankly, is absurd. Again, I maintain that nobody could really believe it. Neither does anyone believe that 70% of African American children being born to a woman without a husband is either a good thing, nor do they believe that it's due to anti-Black racism. They say it, but they don't believe it. They are bluffing.
That is a taste of the thinkers of this camp. I appreciate aspects of this camp's thinking. However, like the outside-in paradigm, this camp is missing something deeper. For the most part, these are the two perspectives that dominate our public conversation around race in America. Both perspectives have elements of truth. When you listen deeply, they are both persuasive. It is interesting to think about which camp resonates with you the most. Again, for complicated reasons, I think both camps come up short in explaining the depth of what we are seeing with our students in schools. There is something deeper going on, under layers and layers, that needs addressing. This is the thesis of my talk today. There has been profound trauma in America for African Americans. We are living together in the aftermath of that trauma, not understanding it. There are lasting effects to trauma which create tension and complexities. Those lasting effects show up in our schools. Healing trauma is difficult. We are healing, and we could do a better job. When it comes to race in America, our history has been more traumatic, longer, and more recent than we know. This is important to understand. There are a bunch of reasons for our racial amnesia. It's a consequence of information being lost to history, a privilege we have to ignore it, and our inability to grapple with the brutality and trauma of our history collectively. Regardless of the reasons, our lack of understanding is getting in our way. I don't understand why you're still bringing up slavery. That was over 400 years ago. Can't you just move on? This is a common retort from white Americans during racial discussions. When you start to understand our history, the ignorance of this statement becomes obvious. This is not just a story of victimization. African Americans have survived and overcome in the face of horrific brutality. They've shown bravery and resistance. They've shown grace and thriving. They've forged families under brutal conditions. They forged institutions under neglect and opposition and terrorism. They forged cultures that have shaped our world. And they forged a collective understanding of inhumanity that has made the world better. The trauma has created lasting effects, however. Claude Anderson puts it well.
Now, what's going to drive us into this underclass structure? First of all, are the legacies of slavery and Jim Crowism. We are still bearing the burdens and the scars. They were never corrected. That's one of the failings of our leadership in this country. They had the nerve, the audacity to let black folks suffer for 460 years. And at the end of the civil rights movement, rather than going back and saying, let's find out what has happened to black folk for 460 years. Have they been psychologically, emotionally, politically, educationally damaged? Nobody spent 1 minute of time trying to figure out what had happened to black folk over all that period of time. So in the course of the civil rights movement, at the end of it, they say, well, let's pretend that nothing has happened to them, that they were not injured, they were not hurt. And now let's go seek integration and pretend that we're all equal. Now that was grossly unfair.
That is a really powerful observation. 3 years ago, I started to learn a lot about trauma and healing. I'm going to share with you some of the learnings I've gained over that time. There are quite a few prominent thinkers on this idea of unresolved historic trauma. These are a few books that address the economic and psychological consequences of our traumatic history. Historic trauma has profound psychological impacts. There is something pernicious about trauma. When the trauma is over, it leaves the victim with the emotional wounds that need to be healed. This is a powerful image by Takesha Brown representing how trauma disrupts normal growth. A person can get stuck at the point of trauma, and even though they grow physically, emotionally, that previous stage needs healing. One of the most powerful wounds that a trauma victim experiences is shame. Shame is a deep sense that I am bad. The core of me is messed up. Unfortunately, our society reinforces this shame in so many ways. Shame is one of the most powerful emotions humans can feel. It is attached to survival, one of our earliest and rawest emotions. Shame is so powerful that people can't tolerate feeling it for long. Shame triggers a fight-flight response to avoid feeling it. When someone experiences shame, the flight reaction can look like avoiding, disengaging, and even self-sabotaging to avoid triggering the shame. In our schools, this can show up in students avoiding new experiences, like joining interesting after-school clubs, which may be a stretch for the student and trigger shame in front of their peers. It can also partially explain higher rates of school absenteeism as an avoidance reaction. So the flight response from shame can be powerful. In Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, she discusses what she calls ever-present anger and how this anger can sit just below the surface for many African Americans and manifest when triggered by shame and stress. In her book, she elicits many examples of what this can look like. Here, I found a video, and here is what ever-present anger can look like. This video can be difficult to watch, but it can do a good job showing how for some, this anger can erupt.
This, man, god damn! I paid for this seat!
Yeah, so did I. Hey man, that's
Christ, man.
You can't just do. Okay. Sir, why did you just do that? I have stuff in there.
I paid for this seat. That's my luggage spot, man.
And I paid for my seat too. There's other available spot. Why are you
Alright,
doing
dude,
this?
I need my bag up there.
Okay,
Go
and
somewhere
I have
else,
mine
man.
before yours. I don't understand why we have to do that. I'm gonna remove yours.
Sir,
You
do
just
not
told
touch
me-
my bag, bro. No, bro. What the fuck is you doing, man? This is my seat. I paid for this.
I understand that.
All right then. What do you not get?
Well, I paid for my seat too.
All right, well, you need to put your bag somewhere back there. This is my seat. Right above it is his.
But
That's where I sit.
I understand that, and mine was taken, so that's why.
What that got to do with me? I paid my hard-earned money.
I paid my hard-earned money.
Okay,
just
well, you
like
need to figure it out, man. Figure it out.
Again, it's a tough video to watch. We have experiences like this in our schools. Again, I want to stress that while these anger responses are a part of the aftermath of trauma, they do not represent all African Americans. However, this is a phenomenon that exists for many. I titled this talk, Healing Together. Healing from trauma is especially difficult when healing in the presence of the oppressor. In the early stages of healing, there is a natural tendency to form one's identity in opposition to that of the oppressor. Dr. Amos Wilson captures this sentiment when he says, "The idea for us is not to share equality with whites because the system they represent is one that should be rejected." Again, in the early stages of trauma recovery, resistance is a core instinct. As Bettina Love says, Black joy is a joy that originates in resistance, a joy that comes from releasing pain and teaching from a place of resistance, agitation, purpose, love, and mattering. She is saying a lot there. The idea of joy coming from resistance is powerful. Like I said in the beginning of this presentation, we are living together in the aftermath of trauma, and we are not understanding it. Resmaa Menakem said something powerful in his book. Trauma decontextualized looks like culture. Many in our world misinterpret the symptoms of trauma as culture. It is much deeper than that. The goal is to heal our traumatic history. I think we are healing, and we can do better. First, we have to understand that healing trauma is different. Healing trauma is not like healing a broken leg. As Dr. Peter Levine observes, healing trauma is measured in generational time frames. There are no quick fixes. And one doesn't actually heal trauma. One emerges from it transformed. Healing trauma is different. There are many ironies to healing. As Sean Ginwright observed, the effects of trauma can be delayed in a community. That is interesting. Healing trauma is different. Trauma changes the way we see and relate to the world. Dr. Guha lays out how the inner dialogue of a trauma survivor can create tensions in relationships. I'm not good enough. People will hurt or leave me. I have to be perfect. I don't matter as much as other people. These are all trauma responses. Another irony. As Rahida Walker observes, things can feel worse as they get better. As the trauma wanes, there is room for the victim to feel the emotions of trauma, which were pushed down by the need to survive. Healing from trauma is different. Another irony. The victim can become attached to their pain, as Natalie Gutierrez says. This is a very human response. In her book, she describes the urge to hold on to pain as it becomes a part of one's identity, or the feeling that by releasing the pain, we will let the oppressor get away with their crime. Again, a very human response. Another irony. For some, separation is an important step in the initial stages of recovery. In the book, The Devil You Know, the author lays out a plan for African Americans to take over 5 states in America, Georgia, the Carolinas, etc. Others desire smaller acts of separation, to live or go to school separately, for example. Separation can help in the early stages of identity formation. However, the goal is to use the healing from separation to reintegrate fully into the world with all of its thorns. Prolonged separation can create its own ills and keep one stuck in early stages of the healing process. I love this quote by Dr. Hemphill. Healing is the lifelong process of restoring the capabilities of safety, belonging, and dignity on the other side of trauma. Again, the goal is to heal from our trauma. I'd like to tell a couple stories of some of my students. These are not their real names. This student, Teray, so let me introduce Teray. When Teray struggles, he has the flight reaction. He misses class. When in class, he falls asleep or disengages from the class altogether. If we were to visualize Teray's response, it would look something like this. Here we have a chart showing kind of your normal baseline disposition. You know, most of us kind of hover around this. We go up a little, we go down a little throughout the day. For Teray, when he experiences a trigger of shame, he immediately goes into hypoarousal. And then he stays in that stage for quite some time. And then with some work and with some healing, you know, he can kind of emerge back to his baseline. Sometimes this heightened state can last for days. So if he has a trigger on Monday and he may you know, not be able to get back to baseline until Wednesday, Thursday. Sometimes it's within a day. I'd like to introduce you to Cordell. Cordell has the opposite reaction. When he feels shame, it shows up differently as the fight reaction. So for Cordell, it looks like this. Again, a trigger happens and it escalates really powerfully to a really heightened response. And again, that response can take a long time to get down to baseline. So when working with my students, the goal is, there's a couple goals, but one of them is to shorten the arousal period. Imagine the progress that can be made in the student's life if we were just able to shorten that arousal period. So instead of taking hours and days and weeks to get back down to baseline, wonder if we could shorten that. Now, it's not perfect and it takes a long time to experience, to get these gains, but this is a goal when you're working with students. Once a student starts to feel control over their reactivity, what you can see is not only a shortening of the length of the arousal period, but also a lowering of the intensity. So now a trigger will happen, and instead of being at a 10, now they're at a 2, and it only lasts for, let's say, 20 minutes, and now we're back to kind of baseline. This is real progress when working with students. Again, this doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes this can take years of working with students. Eventually, a student will barely be affected by the trigger. And so this is really powerful. Imagine you're at work and something triggers you a little bit. You know, you have a little sensation, but you're able to kind of get back to baseline pretty quickly. So one of the pieces of wisdom that, frankly, I didn't invent, but that I've learned from excellent teachers around me and administrators is, number one, you have to allow the student to have the shame wave or the triggered response. A lot of teachers don't understand that, and the minute the escalated response happens, they send the kid out. And I get that. Like, that is a natural response. You have a class of 30 kids, you're all trying to be peacefully working, and so sometimes that's necessary. But for healing to happen, we have to accept that those shame waves happen, and we have to allow them to some extent. Now, this is where it gets really powerful. We have to help the student become aware of their response. This can happen by simply acknowledging very gently with the student, hey, I see that this triggered you, and I noticed that you fell asleep right after that. That's interesting, isn't it? We want to help them rebuild the inner narrative that's going on in their head. And we want to help the student recognize that they are in control. These are the elements to help a student go from a heightened response that is prolonged to, barely a blip. Here's an example. I was working with my student Cordell. This is a real example that happened about a month ago. So I'm going to swear here just to give you the intensity of what has happened. All of our students were working in the class, and I could see that Cordell was getting pretty agitated, and he was starting to escalate. So I walk over to him, and he said, "Man, I hate this fucking class." And my response was, "Oh, why do you say that?" "Because there are too many fucking steps." "I see. There are a lot of steps, aren't there?" "Nah, I ain't doing this shit." "I see. That must be really frustrating. I know you can do it. You killed the last assignment. Would it be helpful if I talked you through each of the steps?" "Nah, I ain't stupid." "Absolutely not. You got this." What happened on the other side of this conversation wasn't magic. Cordell kind of sat down, and he got about halfway through his project. But what was powerful was after that, I kept him after class, and I helped him first realize that he, instead of flying up to a 10 and being sent out of the room and having all that chaos, he was able to control his escalation. And so I complimented him. I said, "Cordell, man, I saw that you were about to, kind of flip out, but here's what I appreciate. You kind of got yourself under control, and you did what you needed to do." And you could see a light bulb go off in his head. "Oh, I can do that." So that was really powerful. We talked about rebuilding the narrative in students' heads. Here is something that I integrated into my assignments. For all of my assignments, I put this little question up here. How difficult do you think this project will be? On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being so hard I can't do it, and 1 being way too easy and everything in between. I don't really talk about this with students at the beginning. I just have them do it on their own, rate. Hey, they think it's going to be an 8. Then at the very end of the project, it says, how difficult was this project? Here's where it gets interesting. No matter what they pick for both of these, it's great conversation to help rebuild the narrative. If a student picked 8, here, they thought it was going to be really hard, and at the end they picked a 2. Within 2 sentences, you can say something like, "Wow, Cordell, man, you thought that was going to be really hard. You did it anyways, and it turned out to be pretty easy. Nice job." That little narrative change can be really powerful. Or if a student picked a 2 at the very beginning, and at the end they picked a 9, that's another place to compliment them. "Cordell, you came into this thinking it was going to be really easy. Through the course of the project, you found out it was going to be really tough, but you still did it. Man, that is powerful." So it's these little moments that we're catching students and helping them rebuild their narrative and gain confidence in themselves. So what we just did was we looked at one small way, or a couple small ways, that we can help our individual students in real time in our classes overcome and kind of master the shame wave that can get in their way. We're going to pivot right now to looking at how we can heal as a society. There are many models for healing trauma. We're going to look at 4 different ways to think about healing. At the end, If we were in the session at the end, I'd ask you to pick one and process it with a neighbor. First, we're going to look at what's called the 6 A's of healing traumatic history. These 6 A's come from a lot of different sources. I picked them up from Lonnie Lynn. This is Common, the rapper's father. But again, these are out there and you know, being used in a lot of different places. But this is a powerful model for showing the work broader society and white society must do to foster a culture of healing. This is an example of outside-in healing that we talked about from the beginning. Let's look at each of these elements. Abatement, actually stopping the trauma. That's the first step. We cannot heal if the trauma is continuing. Acknowledgement, recognizing and accepting the past wrongs inflicted on a community. Apology, offering a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, expressing remorse, and taking responsibility for the harm caused. Appreciation, recognizing and valuing the community's resilience, strengths, and contributions while also acknowledging the historic hardship and trauma endured. Amendment, making amends or reparations for the harms caused. And atonement, efforts to restore relationships, build trust, and ensure that similar injustices do not occur. One of the problems we have in our society is that, especially for white America, we want to jump straight to atonement, restoring relationships, and we are not allowing for these other fundamental aspects of healing to occur before that. Now we're going to look at what is called the snail model of reconciliation. This is a powerful visual of how trauma can create what Olga Bochavora calls the snail model of reconciliation. We can consider this model an inside-out model for healing. In other words, healing that comes from within. Bocharova's work focuses on international conflict. Think Israel-Palestine. So while this is not a perfect fit for the African American experience, I think it holds a lot of truth. Here, trauma happens, and a person can get lost in what she calls a vengeance cycle, or a cycle of pain and retribution. And that can look like realization of loss, denial, anger, a desire for justice and revenge, telling and retelling the right conflict story, acts of justified aggression, and then again, we're back in this loop. A person can slowly emerge from the vengeance cycle through processing grief, mourning, developing empathy for the oppressor, and so forth. Healing from trauma is a tough process and fraught with setbacks. Trauma psychologists acknowledge how easy it is to be pulled back into the vengeance cycle during the healing process. For some, for instance, starting to confront their fears and try new things can trigger shame when they struggle in front of others, and it can put them back into the vengeance cycle. So you can see that as they're emerging out of the vengeance cycle, they can have these relapses into this retributive state. Now, the more experience and the further you get along in the healing process, the harder it is the more resilient one becomes to those setbacks. Let's look at another model. This one is called New Mountain, New Soldier. David Brooks says, in the process of healing trauma, there are many mountains to climb. The important thing to understand is that each mountain requires a different soldier. Let's imagine this mountain as the fight for civil rights. The soldier that was so successful was one of protest, mass organization, and naming the inhumanity and contradictions of whites. That was a successful soldier in the fight for civil rights. Let's imagine this mountain as the quest to heal from historic trauma. The tendency is to rely on the same soldier that was successful in the past mountain. However, climbing the mountain of healing will require a different soldier. Using the previous soldier can actually be counterproductive. Okay, for our last model, and we're almost done, we're going to look at a model of who do we need to be as teachers and care practitioners working with students. Many of us have seen this graphic showing the need for to redistribute resources in order to create equity. I hope this talk has argued that I think the reality is much more complicated and involves a need for both changes to our organizations as well as healing from within the community. This graphic is powerful because it asks us as teachers and school administrators, who do we need to be in order to help remove the barriers, some internal, that have turned some of our students away from the game? Okay, we are finished. These are the 4 models we just looked at. Again, there are many models. These are 4 that I thought were powerful and relevant to our discussion. If we are in the session, I would have you pick one of these models and apply it to your life, your work, whether you're in Ghana, whether you're in America, etc. I will challenge you, however, if you naturally lean towards the inside-out camp of healing trauma, I would challenge you to pick the opposite, so pick the outside-in camp. Similarly, if you naturally gravitate to the outside-in camp, I would challenge you to look at the other model. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciated presenting, and I look forward to your feedback.